What's up, podcast friends? And thank you for listening to the College Admissions Process podcast. While analyzing the podcast data, I realized that many of the earlier episodes, some of which received the most overall downloads and are still extremely relevant today, are not being listened to as much as the newly released episodes. This is why I created the alphabetical list of colleges available on the podcast with the link to the related interview to the right of each school. Please use the alphabetical list as part of your college search, which can be found in the show notes and on my website, www.collegeadmissionstalk.com. The alphabetical list serves as an on-demand virtual college fair with schools from throughout the country. To highlight how valuable the alphabetical list is, I will release past episodes that receive the highest overall downloads on Wednesdays throughout the summer. Please share the alphabetical list with anyone you think that may benefit, as it has proven to be such a valuable tool for so many listeners. So are you ready? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the CAP, the College Admissions Process podcast. I am your host, John Durante, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Rick Clark, who's the Executive Director for Strategic Student Access and Enrollment at Georgia Tech. Now, Rick's colleague, Samantha Rose Sinclair, was with us for episode 38, where we spoke specifically about Georgia Tech. Rick himself was with us in episode 135, where we spoke about the first edition of his book, The Truth About College Admission. And it's a great pleasure to have Rick back once again for episode 200, where we're going to talk about the second edition of The Truth About College Admission, which I'm really excited about. Rick, I want you to know I read the book cover to cover. It is phenomenal, and I want my audience to know two things. Number one, I don't get paid for saying it. And number two, we are here because I know that this conversation is going to bring a lot of value to them. So, Rick, welcome back. How are you?
I'm good, John, and congratulations to you. 200, man. That's no small feat. So I'm looking for. First of all, I'm honored to be on for a second time, and certainly for this kind of monumental sort of milestone you got here. 200. That is amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. And it was such an honor, first of all, to have you on, your colleague on again, Samantha Rose Sinclair. But it was also great at the NACAC conference. I saw you down in Baltimore, and it was just so great to actually see you in person and, have an opportunity to chat with you. So I really appreciate your friendship, your mentorship. You're awesome. And so I really thought it would be great to have you on with episode number 200, because the name of your book is The Truth About College Admission, but that's also going to be the theme of today's episode. So let's get right to it, Rick. Let me ask you, what are the significant changes or trends in the college admission landscape have you observed since the first edition of your book? And how does the second edition address these developments?
Well, we published the book. The second edition came out, like you said, just in the fall. And a couple of the things that we put our fingers on based on feedback and also based on changes, I'd say, one, we took a whole chapter just to talk about conversations around paying for college, because it's not like in 2019 when the first one came out that wasn't a big deal, but it's only continued to be a huge part of the equation in terms of what families really need to be thinking about, how they can approach this, how can they make sense of things. That's one. And of course, right now, and we can get into this if you want to, we find ourselves in a particularly turbulent financial aid year with the new FAFSA and some of the delays that have been happening. But just to put that on the shelf for a second. The other thing, of course, is test optional. And, again, when we published in 2019, there were under 1,000 schools in the country who said, send your test if you want to, don't send them if you don't want to. And honestly, that was pretty clear. But with the pandemic forcing, in many cases, schools to make a pivot on this, and then do so under duress, now double that number are test optional. Of course, you got the whole California system being test blind or test free. And now there's some schools going back to testing. And so the whole landscape around standardized testing, we did touch on and sort of revisit in the book. And I would say that's another big piece. And then, we make speculation a little bit in the book around other huge things that have happened this year. Around the Supreme Court case, on race conscious admission, AI, and sort of what's happening in the AI space. I mean, there really are so many huge developments happening. It's like, man, we might
Hmm.
have to put another edition out faster than just 5 years this time.
Well, that's fantastic. Then you talk about so many things. First of all, paying for college, which is a theme that comes on over and over again in the
Hmm.
podcast episodes. So let's unpackage that a little bit. I know you talked
Yeah.
about AI and the Supreme Court case and
Hmm.
the test optional nature of college admission, and we'll touch upon all of these. But in
Yeah.
terms of paying for college, you mentioned the FAFSA and everything that
Mhm.
the families have been going through this year, including myself.
Yeah.
What could you say about it? Not so much in terms of getting it submitted. But from the admission side, Rick,
Hmm. Hmm.
you're going to get a lot of people that are going to complain that they didn't get their FAFSA in. So, how does that look from your side of the table in terms of not only admitting students, right, but offering them
Yeah.
the proper merit based scholarships or financial aid, if you will?
Right. And this is where you really see that the landscape of higher education in America is very vast.
Hmm.
First of all, you have a small slice, a very small slice of schools that happen to get a disproportionate amount of press, right? That are highly endowed, they're well ranked, they're world known, and they have the ability, even in a year like this, to put out preliminary packages where they may not know exactly the funding source, but they know their pockets are deep enough to go ahead and package kids without having full FAFSA data, right? I
Hmm.
mean, these are your Ivy League and quote unquote your Ivy Plus schools. But that really makes up a very, very small percentage of schools. Other schools who are merit only, they need the FAFSA, but in many ways they kind of don't too, because they can put out their merit money really independent of the need side of things. But where I think we are finding ourselves in a really tough spot, and this impacts a lot of students and definitely a lot of colleges, is that FAFSA data that has to come in. And first of all, it's like, okay, it's one thing for it to be available, right? It's another thing for it to be processed, received, and actionable. And that's what the real delay is for families right now. And, of course, as humans in general, I mean, the reason we get stressed about things and the reason we have anxiety about things is when it's unknown and when we have to wait and when there's a lot of uncertainty and when there's a lot of mystery. And man, that's all those things are happening right now. And there have been changes too. So this is important for students who are, it's as your own family is dealing with returning college students, because things are changing in what you're going to possibly qualify for, and how the federal government is using methodology to determine aid to students, right? And at the end of the day, I think what we're going to see is, unfortunately, kids having to, obviously wait longer in order to make these decisions. And in the meantime, they're getting a lot of pressure because we're in yield season now. So they're
Hmm.
getting a lot of pressure to make a decision, put down a deposit. And my fear, I think, a little bit is that, in the absence of good financial information, there may be decisions made prematurely. Now, this is where, as you've seen, probably a lot of colleges are starting to move their deposit deadline back,
Right.
beyond the May 1 sort of traditional time frame, in order to accommodate for that. But it's a mess. I mean, it really is a
Hmm.
mess. Thankfully, this is a 1 year only problem. But anybody caught up in this 1 year, that's what we're dealing with, and that is difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that overview. And one of the many things you speak about, Rick, in your book is that one of the things that is certain is that there's a lot of uncertainty in
Yeah.
college admission,
Mhm.
and that we should be mindful that we can control what we can control. So, what would you say are some of the other things that applicants and their families control? And perhaps more importantly, what can you tell us about the things that they don't control in the college process?
Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, this goes back to what we were just talking about. One of the reasons when you talk to families about what stresses you out around college admission, it is this feeling of it's a black box, I don't know what's going to happen. It's unpredictable, right? And that is true, and it's also not true. So, as I look at this, I would argue that families have about 75% control over their college journey. First of all, in America, there are many, many colleges and universities, and you don't have to apply to any of them, and you certainly don't have to apply to all of them. You get to pick where you apply, right? And so that's a choice. That's a choice. And maybe you choose to apply to 7 or 12 or whatever your number is, but you get to choose that. And that is control. Now, those applications go in, and it is true that you do not control exactly where you get in, nor do you control exactly how much money they provide for you to go to that college or university. And that is true. And that's also something you shouldn't try to control. Because, when people try to control that, that's when people go to jail and documentaries don't try to control that, right? But if you listen to your school counselor, if you talk with other families who have been through this process before, and if you're sort of wise about where you apply and you're excited about every place you apply to, you don't apply to places you wouldn't actually go. That doesn't make any sense. Don't do that. But you apply to places you'd be excited to go, and you apply to a range of schools. Let's say you do apply to 9 and you get into 3. All right. Well, now you have 3 choices, and you do get to choose of those 3 where you go, and that's control. So you got 3 things that have happened. I chose where to apply. I did not choose or get to pick or control where I got in or how much, but now I get to pick of my 3 where I go. And then this is super important. And I know as a principal, you see this all the time. You get to choose how you show up there. You control that. And some kids show up every day in a high school or every day on a college campus with very different attitudes about what they're going to take advantage of and how they're going to approach things. And so if there's 4 sort of pieces of this puzzle and you control 3, that's 75%. And man, I think most of us, if someone were to say, hey, John, you can control 75% of tomorrow, you'd be like, give me that, man. I will take that, right? That's not bad. That's not bad.
It's definitely not bad. And I appreciate that you talk about the fact that we control 75% in the process, because during our last conversation, Rick, you spoke about institutional priorities and how your own alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill, can only accept 18% of out-of-state students. Now, ironically, I just had a conversation with Jason McGrath, who's the Associate Provost and Director of Undergraduate Admission at UNC Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
So this is important for future college students and their parents to understand, as they may have done everything right in terms of the courses they took over their 4 years of high school and the leadership they demonstrated in during their activities outside of the classroom. But because of these institutional priorities, they are deferred, or even worse, Rick, they're denied. So, what else can you tell us about institutional priorities and college undergraduate admissions goals and how they change from year to year?
Yep. Well, here's one thing is every college, no matter how big or small they are, starts with one very key driver for their institutional priority, and it is called class size. That is institutional priority number 1. And so take Chapel Hill, and Jason is a great guy. And if you haven't listened to that episode, you should go back and listen to it. Great guy, very smart, great experience and background. And I'm really proud that he's leading Chapel Hill right now. But Chapel Hill is going to have a class size goal, and they're going to get a certain number of applications for those spots. And based on their historical yield, that's going to dictate their admit rate, right? I live here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm surrounded by schools that have various bowl sizes. If this is soup that we're making, then Agnes Scott College, an all women's college that's very close to me, is going to have a relatively small bowl size. Morehouse's might be a little bit bigger than that, and Georgia Tech's a little bigger than that, and Georgia State's is like getting to be like a vat instead of a bowl, right? But everybody then starts to say, okay, well, how are we going to fill up our bowl? We know our size, and that's institutional priority 1. What are we going to do from there? Well, Georgia Tech's going to say, all right, we need 60% to be from Georgia, 30% from out of state, 10% from out of country. And that's where you get into starting to make your soup, right? You got your carrots, you got your celery, you got your onions. You're trying to figure that out. And then where you go from there is, for instance, let's say you hire a new business school dean, and they come in and they're like, hey, we want to grow, right? We're going to get aggressive and we're going to grow. And the admission dean or director or VP of enrollment management, they are getting these type of things thrown at them and trying to figure out, with our bowl size, how do we create this composition that's going to meet the institutional priorities and goals of our particular institution. What I would say the takeaway of that is two things. You're never going to 100% know every institutional priority. Hell, we don't know every institutional priority before the year starts, right? Some of this stuff comes on the fly. It has come on the fly almost every year. There's something that gets sort of thrown in there about we're trying to grow this, shrink this, modify this, right? I do think there's some ways you can get a sense of it. Number one, for students, the biggest and most important thing is you should ask. And kids need to feel more empowered to ask the questions that they care about and what matters to them. And that is not an off the table question. And think about your own high school and all these college reps that come to visit. That's a great question to ask. Hey, what are you trying to achieve? What are your institutional priorities? That's not a taboo question. It's a great question. For parents, I think the big thing is don't try to necessarily like figure all this out or game the system to try to make your kid look like they are or are not like of the institutional priority. I think the bigger thing to say is, to your point, what you said at the beginning is so important. Yes, there are certain things that colleges are looking at and looking for, and you can do all those things, quote, right, or almost perfectly or really extremely well. GPA, course choice, testing, outside the classroom stuff, essays, and it still doesn't go your way. And as a parent, I think what we need to understand is that is beyond our control. But what we need to empower our kids with is the confidence that that's not about them. That's not about them and their ability and their potential and their future. That is about that college, that year, and the way this thing shook out. And parents will often ask, like, what should my role be? What's my job? And I believe that the role of a parent is to give perspective and to say, listen, let me tell you about all the people I know, including myself probably, who have not had a very non-predictable, non-linear path to success and fulfillment and, all these things. Let me tell you about the guy down the street who, had this happen and that happen. It looked like a reroute. It looked like a dead end. And he veered around that and figured it out, and life is really good now. I think that's what we need to do as parents is kind of understand that those sort of institutional priorities and goals do drive admission decisions, and they are working in concert with, but not exclusively around the things that people say they're looking at in the admission review process, right? It's almost like the NCAA basketball tournament that's coming up. This idea that you might have the ACC might be the absolute best conference in the country. You're just not going to fill the whole NCAA tournament with ACC teams. You want to spread it out. And that's the kind of concept, right? That institutional priorities drive.
Well, I appreciate that, Rick, because so many students, like I said earlier, they work so hard on their academics over 4 years, their activities outside of the classroom, their personal essay, and every other piece of the application, only to find out that they get accepted to a few schools, but that number one school, they got deferred or sometimes denied. And they think, wow, was it my essay? Maybe I should have taken this course over that course.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's very important for people to understand that, like you said earlier, you control probably about 75% of it, but there's definitely a huge piece where we don't control, right? Because of those institutional priorities, which, as you put it, you'll never really know what they are from year to year. However, I love how you talked about parents. Let your students take agency. Let them ask the question. When the reps come to your local high school or you see them on campus or at a college fair, certainly ask the question, and you'll be surprised how willing people are to share their institutional priorities as much as they can anyway. So, knowing all that Rick, from working in admission for decades, what would the college process look like for you if you were starting over and seeking the right fit for yourself?
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting looking back at my own personal journey on this, because I really wanted to play college soccer. And that was a huge driver for me. And knowing what I know now, I think I would have had that take more of a back seat. And that's not to say that's for everybody, right? That's the dream of a lot of kids, and that's not a wrong dream. Right. And a lot of people go to college and they play sports and they kind of have that balance, and it's perfect. I think for me though, and what I learned, pretty quickly was maybe that wasn't really what should have been the primary driver, and I should have been a little more focused on making a sort of holistic decision for me as a student, a person, and an athlete, not just necessarily as an athlete. And I think about that for my kid. I have a 15-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter, and as they get closer to this, and we're not really talking to them much about it at all right now, way too early. But as they get closer to it, I think that's how I'm going to be sort of coaching them and trying to partner with them in this is letting them really think about, ask big questions. Brennan Barnard, who I wrote the book with,
Mhm.
he has this whole thing about how adults often, when you're a junior in high school, maybe even a sophomore, it depends on the community that you live in. But man, adults, like, they have nothing else it seems like they can ask you when you're that age except where you want to go to college. And where are you going to go to college? Where are you going to apply to college? And he says, like, you should never get to where so fast. You need to
Mm.
back all the way up this hierarchy of questions to say, who am I? What am I excited about? Who are the people I want to be around? Like, what are the type of environments I work best in? What do I like about my high school? And what do I really want different about college that's, not like this in high school? And you get to where later. And so we sort of walk before we crawl on this a little bit. And I do
Mm.
think that I would tell my 17-year-old self, and hopefully I'll tell my 17-year-old son and daughter, like, ask those type of questions, and then we'll worry about what matches and fits to that. And I've had people say this idea that too often we try to match college to kid instead of kid to college. And I
Mm.
think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I do know, and I think that's phenomenal. And for those students that are listening out there that are probably aggravated, where every time they see a relative, you're asked, "Well, where you going to college?" Maybe the answer should be, "Well, where did you go to college?
Totally.
What would you do differently? What did you like
Yes.
about where you went? What didn't you like?" Right? So you
Yes.
turn the table.
I
So
love that.
let's look a little into the overall application review process, Rick, because many believe, for example, that the GPA number alone is the most important factor in admissions,
Hmm.
probably because they believe there should be a cutoff number or some form of measuring whether you'll be admitted or not, right?
Hmm.
So we know that the application review process is more than just one number, especially since so many schools report reviewing applications in a holistic manner. In fact, you state in your book, and I quote, when we talk about holistic admission review, we mean there is no numeric formula. There
Yep.
is no one thing. So, Rick, can you explain how the GPA does come into play while looking at the context of the courses the student has taken over their 4 years of high school, especially when you are reviewing students from thousands of high schools with different methods of weighing the courses they offer, not to mention the varied offerings themselves? Rick, what
Yeah.
do you think?
No, I mean, listen, when I got to Georgia Tech, I got here in 2003, and we really were at a point where we were accepting, 65% of kids.
Hmm.
And the GPA was super helpful, and we didn't have to differentiate a whole lot, right? We would just say, okay, we're going to sort of let the slack out on the rope, and we'll start taking kids at the highest GPA and sort of work down till we have put out enough admits. But to your point, as our applicant pool grew and the quality in the applicant pool grew and the proliferation of grading scales, curriculum types, kids from all the states and many countries outside of here, then the numbers started to just almost mean nothing. And you had to start to say, okay, let's just start with question number one. Where does this kid go to high school? What could they have taken? What did they choose to take? How did they do along the way, not only ninth through 12th grade, but also in individual subjects? And when we talk about holistic review, you're talking about digging into all those type of things.
Hmm.
And people always are like, oh, the school down the street's easier than this school, or whatever. Everybody seems to go to not the school down the street, right? They go to the other, and our job and where we start, and I don't mean just Georgia Tech, I mean colleges. Where we start, if you have a holistic review process, is to say, I mean, the number matters, kind of, but we got a lot of other questions first about those kind of things, right? Um, and and you really have to dig into it because I've been fortunate to travel, I think, to 45 states for my job at Georgia
Wow.
Tech, and now 5 different continents for
Hmm.
this. I've been into so many different high schools around the country and around the world. I'm seeing a little bit of everything. Situations where you can only take 2 APs a year, and there's
Right.
limits on that. Schools where you got to petition to get into certain classes. Grading scales that go from 90 to 100, or from 93 to 102, and there's all kinds of added points. And you know the easy days of when I first got here, of like sort of everybody's on a 4.0 scale, and sort of a 3.9 means something, are just so far gone now. And so I think that that's where when we do responsible holistic admission review, it means we ask a lot of questions. And the numbers still matter, and the grades do matter, but there's a lot about grade trends. There's a lot about what major are you looking to study, and how does this align with it, right? We even now, I mean, people wonder, what are we doing with AI, in admission, and where's that going? And one of the things I'll tell you is, 5 years ago, it was very difficult with the systems we use. You were like duct taping things together to try to figure out, how did a kid from this high school do on our college campus, and what does that mean for this year's applicant pool? It is so much easier now.
Hmm.
And that's the future. People are like, what's more predictive, GPA or SAT? I'll tell you what's more predictive. You got a kid from the same high school who took the same classes in that high school that's now on your campus. How are they doing? That's
Hmm.
predictive, right? And
Absolutely.
that's really here from from a technical standpoint. And that's why all of this matters.
Yeah, it's definitely predictive, because if you have a student from a particular high school with a particular GPA and courses that he or she took, certainly that'll give you some level of indication if there's another student coming from that high school, and we appreciate that. I also want to mention that a lot of people always talk about reviewing applications holistically. We also spoke about how in some of the podcast episodes, admissions reps look at the transcript holistically. So it's not just the GPA, but it's, as
Mhm.
you put it, number one, where did you go to high school? What was available to you?
Mhm.
And how did you take advantage? And I like how you talked about the fact that, there are some high schools that might offer 20, 30 advanced placement courses. There may be other that offer the same, yet one high school says, well, in junior year, you can only take 3, for example. That's your max.
Mhm.
And same thing in senior year, right? Whereas the high school down the street, and as you said, there's always that high school down the street, maybe they don't have any limitations. So,
Yep.
admissions reps, they look at the school profile. Am I correct, Rick? And again, it's where you went to high school, what was available to you, and how did you take advantage of that? Anything else you want to add?
I mean, I think that's spot on, and you're right that the profile, right? So this is homework for anybody listening. If you don't know what your profile looks
Hmm.
like, go Google for it, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
go into your counseling office tomorrow and ask for it. Usually, it has things like your grading scale, the courses that are offered. It gives any nuances, like what we just talked about, of, are there limitations, or how do you get into, what kind of curriculum do you have to begin with? Sometimes it'll show your matriculation list. Where do kids go to school over the last couple of years? And that is a touchstone for admission folks. When we open these things up, that is really super helpful and informative. Now, some people have been to that high school a million times. They know it like the back of their hand. They don't really need it. But especially if you're opening up a place that you haven't gotten applicants from in the past, or you may not have had the opportunity to visit, and you're trying to learn and understand it, or if you're in committee and trying to explain it to somebody else, you start there with that profile.
Well, I appreciate you adding to that, Rick. And you mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, a few times. So I just have to ask, in terms of, for example, the college essay, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to write a few prompts in ChatGPT, for example, and all of a sudden you get a phenomenal essay.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think we're going with essays in the future, knowing that ChatGPT
Mm-hmm.
and other AI tools are really good?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because Georgia Tech obviously has a phenomenal computer science major, and therefore world-renowned computer science professors. And
Absolutely.
and we've talked to them about this in the past a little bit. This idea of like reverse AI. Can you run some kind of a tool that says whether or not a student used this? And they'd say 100% bad idea. It's
Hmm.
a fool's errand. It's going to give you a lot of false positives, and you should not do that. Don't worry about that. What you need to focus in on is, why do you even ask for an essay to begin with? What are you trying to get out of that? And does the kid basically supply you and provide you with what it is that, you're looking for? And what we're looking for is their voice. We're looking for individuality. We're looking for specificity. We're looking for personality. ChatGPT does not do a good job of those things.
That's
But
right.
here's where I think ChatGPT is helpful, and I'll also speculate a little bit on the future. I have teenagers in my house, been talking to kids about college admission for a long time. And one of the things that is hard for them, and maybe hard for all of us as humans in general, whether it be working out or mowing the lawn or anything else, is just getting started.
Right.
And they're
Right.
looking at these prompts or they're looking at a blinking cursor, and it's just like maddening. What I think is helpful for ChatGPT is, all right, maybe you're like, I got 3 ideas. Which one should I do? Well, you pop that into ChatGPT. It writes an essay that you would never want to copy and paste and turn in for the reasons we just talked about. But it is like, yeah, I could work with that. Or I thought maybe I'd go that direction, but now that I think about it, nah, I don't really have anything there. That's helpful. The ball is rolling. There's some ideas there. It's almost like brainstorming. It's almost like you and I, if I was sitting there talking to you about coming to visit New York and you give me a couple ideas, and a couple of your ideas are really good, and a couple of ideas are like, that's just not for me. That's helpful. That's helpful.
Right.
And so I think that's good. Now, what I will say is my hope / my prediction is that the essay maybe doesn't go away, but I do believe we're getting closer to a day where there are more opportunities to express yourself in different mediums. In other words, you as a podcast host and a principal, somebody that speaks publicly a lot, if you were given the option, all right, John, you're applying for this job or this honors program or whatever, you can either write an essay or you can submit a minute-long video or a minute-long audio. Like, we know you can write because we have your transcripts from the last couple of years, right? I mean, and that's the thing, that kids think we're reading like English teachers. We do not read like English teachers. That's not what we're looking for, right? And I really hope that AI is a catalyst towards these multiple mediums for submission, both for students and maybe even for counselors and other recommenders. Because I feel like we could get a lot of value from a boss who maybe won't sit down and log into a portal and submit a recommendation, but they can do a quick voice text, a voice memo that says, this kid is amazing. I almost look at them like an extension of my family. I trust them implicitly. That's super helpful. And those multiple mediums of submission, I think, both essay for students and recommendations for the future, in my opinion, that's a good next chapter that AI might help us get to.
Well, we appreciate that, Rick. Thank you so much for giving your insight on AI. And, in your book, you spoke about a student who applied to Georgia Tech and how he had to be mindful of not expressing his lack of interest in his essay, as that is something that is typically reviewed by family members and others. So instead, he used the biographical section of his application to sabotage himself by writing in capital letters the following, and I quote, "Mother, bachelor's degree from College of Charleston, where I really want to go," is what he wrote. Then he said, "Father, bachelor's degree from Georgia Tech," and he added, "where I do not want to go." So, Rick, what would you say to the parents listening about being mindful of not creating these wedges, as you described it in your book, between their children and themselves? And are there other wedges that families create throughout the process? And what are some of the things that families can do to avoid them, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, and Brennan and I talk about this in the book and also in presentations that we give together. I mean, really, fundamentally, at the end of the day, the reason we wrote the book is because we have, and I'm sure you would be in the same camp here, we've seen this go incredibly right and incredibly wrong with families. Sometimes you have families where it's like, it actually brings them closer together. They parents in particular, they're curious about who their kid is, what they are interested in, what they want to achieve in the future, how they can be part of that story getting them there. And there is some give and take and compromise. There is some real honesty and sometimes hard conversations. There's a lot of listening. There's a lot of patience and grace, right? The way that we all want to behave as colleagues, family members, etc., friends, and that bodes well towards not only a 4-year college degree, but a 40-year relationship after college, which of course, as parents, we all want with our kids, right? We all want that. And we lose sight of that sometimes because we believe either we know what's best for them or there's only this small set of places where they can go where it can lead towards ultimate success. And I think that's myopic and ill-founded. But yet I also recognize and acknowledge it comes from a place of love. It manifests itself really whacked out ways sometimes, but it does come from a place of love. I think that is funny because I hadn't thought about that story that you're talking about in a while, but I so distinctly remember that application, and I'm thinking like, how did they get there, right? How did they get there? And somebody told that kid, you have to apply. And he's thinking, I do not want to go there. And, I think it's one of these things where we just have to say like, listen, I mean, we have dreams and hopes for our kids, and of course we want to do our absolute best to set them up for success. But I think we also owe it to our kids to tell them like, listen, I trust you, and I'm proud of you, and I'm with you, right? And we talk here at Georgia Tech a lot about this idea of moving from parent to partner, and that is hard. Yeah, that's a transition, and that's difficult, and it requires all the things we just talked about: grace, listening, patience, but yet it doesn't end up with a kid putting that kind of thing on their application. I think I guess I could put on my hand on so many different things, but the one I will say that's a wedge, I think sometimes, is money. We talked about paying for college earlier, and this in this edition of the book, we have a whole chapter on it, plus other times in the book where we talk about money. It's just such a big deal. And I think my biggest thing there is parents believe oftentimes the biggest gift they can give their kid is opening up the checkbook and just paying for wherever the best place the student gets in or the place they really want to go. I actually don't think that's true. I think the biggest gift we can give our kids is an open conversation about money and an honest conversation about money early. Not when they're seniors and they're already applying, not when they're seniors and they already got in, for sure. But when they're juniors, when they're sophomores, to say, look, we love you, we support you, we want to help you, but here's some of the maybe limitations that we have. Here's some of the sort of expectations we have for you or conditions we have for you. And I think that can become a wedge because sometimes people, they're like, they don't say what they need to say early enough. And literally, I have had families saying, I'm hoping my kid's not going to get into this school because I don't think we can afford it. Well, they should never be that far down the line.
Right.
It's okay to say, go ahead and apply. But if the cost doesn't come down to X, that's not going to be affordable for us. And it's also okay to say, yes, we actually have that much money. We're just not willing to put it into this education. Kids can handle it. They can handle it. And it's also reasonable to say, why? You got to say why. Why? Well, because I don't want to work till I'm 74, or I don't want to sell the second house, or we still want to be able to go on vacation. 17-year-olds can handle that. But what's not cool and happens too often is it's April. The kid's already gotten in. There wasn't a conversation that was honest and early like that. And now all of a sudden they're wearing the hoodie. They posted on Instagram. And now those things are being said. And that's not the way it should go. That's a wedge that can be avoided.
Well, you're absolutely right. And there are so many podcast episodes where I always ask, what are your top 3 pieces of advice? That's always the last question. And so many reps talk about speaking about the financial piece early. To your point, don't wait until April of senior year where, you have the hoodie, you have the sticker for the car, or at least the kid does. And, only to find out that, it's not a financial fit for the family. And as you put it, and I like the way you put it, you have to move from being a parent to being a partner in the college process. And I also want to mention that in your book, you've done a great job in terms of bringing families through the process whole, right, as a unit. I just love the work that you did in that book. And of course, another thing that a lot of students and their families look at are, of course, those things we call college rankings, right, Rick? So in your book, you actually referenced Malcolm Gladwell's revisionist history podcast, where he spoke of people's fixation on college rankings in his episode called Lord of the Rankings. Great insights as to how flawed the rankings really are were revealed as Gladwell interviewed professionals in college admissions, including presidents and so many others. Yet these rankings sell lots of magazine subscriptions, Rick. And I listened to this particular episode after reading your book and would recommend it to anyone who is
Yeah.
interested in college admission. But, Rick, how should people approach the college rankings? And what are some of the things they should be mindful about when reviewing them?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let me just say, I get it. I do understand where this comes from, right? I mean, we're busy and there's a lot going on. And we do sometimes want to get, some seemingly standardized way to review things, And when we do this then we're going to buy a car, we're going to, figure out where we're going to go on vacation. We look at these kind of lists and rankings all the time. I think the big takeaway on it is two things. One, in college admission in general, it is never wise to take any number in isolation or any number as gospel truth. In other words, and I'll give you a very specific example. With Georgia Tech, there have been years where we have literally swung from like number 7 for public universities to number 15, and then back to 8, and then to 12. The same kid who entered as a freshman, who came into a number 7 ranked school, as a sophomore was in the number 15th ranked school, right? And then people will draw these lines and they'll say, I mean, really, and you probably have heard this too. I've had parents say, or kids tell me, my parents wouldn't let me apply to anywhere outside the top 50. Anything that's in engineering below number 20. And I'm like, well, what year? I mean, are they taking a 3-year average? And like these things move. So I do think that's one thing. The other thing I'll say is, admission math is not like normal math. And what I mean by that is we don't all count the same. And a lot of the stuff that gets counted factors into rankings and it skews them as a result. Here's a very good example. Applications. Georgia Tech only counts an application if it's complete. So when we give application totals, we do that when you have a complete actionable application and you can actually make a decision on it. Many schools, however, if there's a partial application, even a part 1 of an application, they count that. Well, then there's a lot of kids that you might not be able to admit. It's not like you chose not to admit them. You couldn't admit them. They weren't complete.
Right.
And that's going to suppress your admit rate, right? And so people will draw this correlation to say, oh, this must be a better school. Their admit rate's lower. Well, how are they counting? What were they counting? That's one thing. The other thing is, as you know, especially in New York, I mean, early decision, right? Huge for many schools. And they'll fill big portions, over half their class out of early decision. Well, early decision is essentially a 100% yield because it's a binding agreement. That lowers your admit rate, right? So if you fill 60% of your class out of early decision, your admit rate looks lower, your yield rate looks higher, and that then factors into rankings. Well, that's skewing the numbers. They're not apples to apples. It's not even like fruit at that point, And so I do think that not everybody's going to know that, but if they're listening to this podcast, hopefully they can appreciate, that that's the reality. And I hate that it's so complicated and it's not always known, but that's why people listen to this stuff and hopefully read the book because that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and the book definitely touches upon these items and so much more. And what I always like to talk about is, if there's a school in the top 10, but the school happens to be in a rural area, and you're someone who wants to be in a urban environment, well, no matter what, whether dad went there, mom went there, your friend is applying, that school is probably not for you, regardless of the fact that it's in the top 10. So, we talk about fit, right? How far do you want to be? Is an airplane ride okay? Do you want to drive? How far is the drive? Is a 6-hour drive okay? Do you want to be within 2 hours? The beauty, Rick, as you know, there's over 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States alone. There is more than one school for every single student, but not every school is for you, regardless if you're in the top 10, 20, 50, whatever it is.
Yep.
So I know it's hard because a lot of people look at the sticker, the sweatshirt, the cap, the hoodie, whatever, but it is really important to be mindful of what you want and be truthful to yourself, students, throughout this entire process. Anything you want to add to that, Rick?
Only that. Wow, there's so much I could add to that, but I agree 100%. But the other thing is, somebody will be like, "Yeah, I applied to every Ivy League school," and I'm like, "Well, you must not be that smart then, because how can you apply to Penn and Dartmouth and like these places are so different than
Very different.
all they're just in the same athletic conference, man. That's it." But no, I 100% agree. I mean, being open, that's the big thing I'd say is like just that willingness to really ask better questions to find places that match up. And then, again, I just want to hit home on this again. I just never apply to a school you wouldn't actually attend. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of places that match up, an entire chapter of your book, Rick, was dedicated to the college visit with lots of great tips and
Mm,
questions to ask to help maximize the overall experience if you are fortunate enough to visit. This, of course, is a very important part of the college search process as it should help to determine fit, right? As we've been talking about. And we speak about it often throughout the podcast episodes that if you can't visit before you apply, you owe it to yourself to really try to visit before matriculating, as nothing replaces being on campus, getting the feel when you're on campus, and even seeing the surrounding area to determine whether or not that school is the right fit for you.
mhm.
So, Rick, can you share a few insights from the book with our listeners, of course, in terms of how to make the most out of their college visit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that, earlier when you asked me like what changed in the book and what are some trends, I mean, one thing we talked a lot more about in the second edition was one of the upsides or bonuses, I guess, that we got out of COVID was, and I'll just admit this as someone, who works on a college campus, prior to the pandemic, we did an exceedingly crappy job with
Hmm.
our virtual programming. And I think most people around the country would agree. Not just that Georgia Tech did a crappy job, that most
Everybody.
colleges were doing it. Like, you like stood it up because you kind of felt like you had to, but you didn't put a whole lot of resource into it. Now, it's amazing what you have access to. I
Hmm.
mean, schools have excellent virtual tours. They have all kinds of opportunities to engage with students, faculty. It's just a much more rich online experience, acknowledging that even if you might have the financial resources to come, do you have the time?
Hmm.
Do you have the ability to get there? And so much better than it ever was before. But to your point, getting there physically, there's nothing that can replace touching, feeling, seeing yourself. What I would say the mistake people make, to flip it from the advice to the mistake a little bit, is they rush. I
Hmm.
mean, we're in Atlanta, right? So a lot of people, let's say they fly in from New York, they're like, bam, we're going to hit Georgia Tech, then we're going to hit Emory, and then we're going to try to get over to Auburn that night. And it's just like they barnstorm through the South, and in doing that, yes, you go to the campus, yes, you hear the spiel and you do the tour, and that's it. And
Hmm.
I would just say one of my biggest tips, and I know this is hard, right? I mean, I get it. I've got teenagers. I know life is busy and you don't have weeks to go sit on college campuses. But if there are places you're legitimately interested in, you owe it to yourself to build in a little cushion so that you can just like what I in the book we talk about loitering appropriately.
Hmm.
Where you're like, and actually right before we recorded this podcast, I spoke at a lunch for alumni, here in Georgia. And this guy was coming to visit tomorrow. And I said, once you're done with the tour and the information session, go to the student center and just sit there and
Right.
just watch people and have a
Right.
conversation and look around and see or listen. What are they talking about? What are they wearing? Well, what does the vibe kind of look
Hmm.
and feel like? Right. I think that is very important. It's a huge investment of time, resources, money, all the things. And people go too fast through these visits. So
Right.
I would say that's one. The other thing is you said you were talking earlier about how asking good questions, and I think too it's like ask the same questions of multiple people, because
Right.
if you ask a tour guide you're going to get a certain perspective. And it's so funny how many times people are like, yeah, I just wrote that school off because I didn't like the tour guide. It's
Hmm.
like that school has 40,000 people there, man. Ask the tour guide, ask a professor, ask a staff member, ask a recent alum, ask somebody that graduated 15 years ago. Lots of, if you can triangulate, you get a much better sense of what that place is really about. What are they proud of? What are they disappointed with? What do they hope will be different in 5 years? As you said in the book, we give a lot of questions like that, and we want to empower students to probe, right? And you can't
Right.
do that when you're just going so fast.
Right. And those are great examples. And like I said earlier, there are so many more in the book itself. I really appreciated reading it. And I wish I had access to it a few years back, even though it just came out the second edition, because it certainly would have helped me and my family as we navigated the process. Another thing that I'll add, though, when you visit campus, maybe a piece of advice to parents, give your child, even if it's an hour to themselves,
Mm,
because there's a full sense, I believe, of comfort when you visit campus with your family. I
mm,
remember doing it with my daughters. And Rick, I got to tell you, I absolutely enjoyed it. I loved it because, as a high school principal for so many years, you hear about all of these different schools that so many kids are going to. And then to actually go through it with your own kids, it's really special as a
mm.
parent, right? And
Yep.
that's frankly what prompted me to create this podcast. But there's that false sense of comfort because you go to the visit, like you said, you register at the admissions office, you take the tour, everybody's happy, you're excited to see this new place, mom and dad maybe take you out for lunch, for dinner, whatever it is, and you feel comfortable because, you're there with a sibling, with your parents. Yet you have to understand that you're going to be there, whether it's an airplane ride away from home, 2 hour car ride from away from home, or what have you, by yourself. So it's very important, I think, that when you visit, to have an hour to yourself. Like you said, Rick, sit on a bench, talk to a random student, go to the dining hall, go to the student center, what have you, and really try, students, to picture yourself there for the next 4 years or more, if you intend, of course, to go to graduate school. What do you think about that, Rick?
Oh
Anything
yeah,
you'd like to
I
add?
love
Or
that. I love that. And we tell students a lot. You go to some schools, and this won't be an option, but if they ever give you the option to even do the tour separately,
Hmm,
let parents go on one tour and
hmm,
and students on another, or even if it's a mix, whatever. Even if you can still break up and do it that way, because first of all, you're going to learn a lot more. You're going to hear different things when you get back in the car later. You have something totally new
hmm.
and different to talk about. And I think what you're saying makes a ton of sense. To have a little bit of time on your own, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, and I love that if colleges actually offer that, where the parents go on one side, the students on the other, and then, like you said, the car ride home or the airplane ride home, whatever it is, there'll be a lot more to talk about
Mhm.
because you'll be able to compare notes. So
And
that,
actually,
yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
glad you said that at the end, but take notes, because
Hmm.
especially if, like, let's say you use a spring break or a summer week or whatever, and
Hmm.
you do end up going to 7 or 8 schools, you will be amazed at how they blur together. It's
Absolutely.
almost like all this stuff we send in the mail, right? It all starts to look the same after a while. And so taking notes, I mean, it doesn't have to be anything super formal, but just like, what are your takeaways? What are the things you liked, have questions about, didn't like, want to get some clarity on, like voice record it, however you do notes, right? Put it
Hmm.
into your phone, write it down, but like have something to walk away with, because you might think something at the time or have a sense of something at the time, but 2 weeks later when you're thinking back on it,
Right.
like, that's important.
Right. And, to your point earlier, someone like myself from New York, we come down to the Georgia area, you're going to see Georgia Tech, Auburn, Emory, what
Hmm.
have you. If you don't take the notes, everything
Yeah.
is going to mix. Did I see this at Emory? Was it Georgia
Yes.
Tech? Wait a minute. No, no, no. It was Auburn.
Yes.
So,
It's so true.
it really is true. It's very important to take notes. It's not just how you feel when you're there. If you don't take the notes, like you said, Rick, in 2 weeks, you're going to forget it all. So we appreciate that. And Rick, another question that comes up when speaking to so many parents is that they believe colleges limit or cap the number of acceptances from a given high school. In other words, perhaps they only accept 3 from a particular high school to spread the wealth amongst high schools, particularly within a certain geographical region. So, Rick, can you shed any insight on this belief and whether or not it's true?
Yeah. It's funny. I was mentioning earlier that I spoke at this lunch,
Hmm.
today, and the title of the talk was "Myths, Misconceptions, Rumors, and Bold-Faced Lies." Which, that'll draw an audience, man. People will come. People
Absolutely. I
will
love
come
that
to hear
title,
that.
man.
And
Maybe
one
I'll
of
use it
them,
for the title of this podcast,
yeah,
Rick.
do it. Go for it, man. Go for it. The truth about college admission, bold-faced lies. But you know, so that quota question is always out there, right? It's always a rumor that's out there. And, Georgia Tech, to my knowledge, we may be the only school in the country that does this, but if people want to go, they can Google for this. But if they put in Georgia Tech admission and snapshots, what you can do is you can actually go, and if a high school has 10 or more students here, you can look at the last 4 years of applicants. How many applied? How many got in? How many came? How are they doing now at Georgia Tech?
Mm-hmm.
We do this by state. We do this by county. We do this by country, right? So it's helpful for us because you might have a kid visiting from New York and they're like, yeah, but I don't know, man, if I want to come to Georgia Tech because there's not that many New Yorkers here. It's like, actually, let me pull up the snapshot and show you how many New Yorkers are actually here. And it also helps, to have a conversation to say, oh, we're not biased about New Jersey versus New York because, you can look at. And so it dispels the quotas conversation. Now, with that said, I will also say it's like both things can be true at the same time. There can absolutely be a high school where, and we've had it, it's a small high school. Let's say you get 7 apps in a year. And there have been years where we have taken all 7. And there have been years we've taken 0 out of that high school. It depends, as you know, as a principal, classes are different, man. First of all, it depends who applies that year. It depends on the kind of character of that particular class that year, right? And so it's not always consistent. I do think that the premise of this and where it comes from is not ill-founded in that, of course, a college doesn't want to allocate all of their spots to one state or one county or one city. That is true. Right. But it also absolutely depends on that particular year, the quality of that particular applicant group, right, from that high school. And so I guess the answer to that is sort of a yes and. But what's not true is this idea that they're going to give 3 here and exactly 3 here and exactly 3 there.
Understood.
That is not true, and we have the data to back it up. And hopefully, more schools will start to put that data out in the future.
Yeah, so it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you try to spread the wealth, right?
Yeah.
However, there's no cap. It's not like you said, this school 3, that school 3, that other school 3, and that's it. It varies from year to year, as you put it, based on the quality, right, and quantity of the applicants from the thousands of high schools throughout the country that apply. Is that right, Rick?
That's 100% right. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate the honesty, the truth, the insight. And Rick, this has been a phenomenal conversation. But before I get to the last question, I have to ask, is there a question I didn't ask or a topic that I didn't bring up that you'd like to share with us now?
Oh, man. Well, we kind of touched on this a little bit, I think. But, I mean, one thing I do try to reinforce is rewinding a little bit to our prior conversation around admit rates and how some people feel like that's a proxy for quality. And I think that's a inaccurate correlation. Again, not just because of the sort of math that we talked about around this, but I mean, I having been here now for 20 years, what I've seen is our admit rate has dropped 50%. We were at 65%. We're at 15 now. And hopefully my president won't listen to this, but I mean, we're like, all right, we're a little better, but a lot of people would look at that. And let's just say in this particular year, they've got 2 schools and they're like, this school admits 65% and this school admits 15%. Man, that 15% school is just so much better. They're just, head and shoulders above. Or you get into these 2 schools and one has a 10% higher admit rate. It's like, well, there's pressure for you to go to the one has a 10% lower. I just think that is really not the right way to approach this. Not only because of the math, which we covered, but also because of the fact that there's just so much more around making a decision than an admit rate that really is not a direct through line to quality. And too often I think people say this is correlative and this is a way I can rank schools, not the rankings per se, but I can rank the quality of schools. And knowing what I know and having seen what I've seen, not just at Georgia Tech, but around the country, I would say that's probably one of those misconceptions that I could put in my presentation for sure.
Well, I appreciate that. And, for some reason, you prompted me to remember a conversation that I was just having with a colleague, which was the conversation about the test optional nature of college admission.
Mm,
Rick, is it true that schools remain test optional because they're simply trying to raise their mid 50? In other words, if you're test optional,
mhm.
the only students that are going to submit are obviously students that feel that they did very well. So by default, that's going to raise your numbers, right? Your mid 50.
Mhm.
You think there's any truth to that?
I think it could be out there a little bit. Yeah. I
Mm,
mean, I think that if here's the way, one way I would look at this is if a school was test optional before the pandemic,
hmm
and again, that was about 900 or so, they made that decision because they had data that showed that GPA and all the other things that we talked about, even now, as I said earlier, data of on that high school, right, that's predictive to help them. They don't feel like they critically need the test, right? And
hmm
I do not think that they were playing games. They did not make that decision under duress. If a school went test optional during the pandemic, then what they're doing right now is they're assessing their data. This is also why some schools are either going back to or continuing on with test optional. But there's a lot of reasons to be test optional. Yes, it could be for profile increase. That could be a tertiary benefit in some cases. But the truth is, most colleges in our country need and want big applicant pools, not just because it looks good, but because then you have more to pick from.
Right.
And
Right.
really, anybody who runs a company or runs a sports team would kind of understand why you want more people to come try out for your team. You want more people to apply to your company, right? If we can take down some of these barriers in order to have a bigger top of our funnel, and then let us figure out who's going to best match to that. I'm not saying that your point is not out there as a possible, and yes,
hmm
that's true. That generally your profile goes up a little bit in testing because students with lower test scores wouldn't send at the same rate. But I actually think the bigger part of it is they believe, and data is showing this to be true. They're actually achieving their class that can be successful on their campus by broadening the top of their funnel. I hate that this has brought so much consternation and confusion because I
hmm
think the concept around test optional is really solid and important.
Yeah, well, what was also really solid and important was your overall description because you're right. It's like if you're running a, Fortune 500 company and you have a position to fill, you want a huge amount of applicants to really get the best of the best, right?
Hmm.
Because your admissions counselors, obviously you want to admit everybody, but really your number one job is to make sure that you admit people that are going to succeed and
Hmm.
do well, right? And
Yeah.
that's why you look at the transcript to see the academic performance in high school, which will hopefully help you determine whether or not they'll be successful in your classes. So I really appreciate everything that you said. This has been, Rick, a phenomenal conversation. I'm so grateful for our friendship. You are certainly a mentor to me. And unfortunately, it does lead us to that last question, which is what are the top three pieces of advice that you would provide a student and their parents getting ready for the college admissions process?
Yeah. Well, a little of this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when you were asking about the tour and questions. One of those is use your network.
Hmm.
Whatever high school you go to, you have in your community that you live in. So maybe you go to a public high school, maybe you go to a private high school, whatever it might be. But use your network. There are probably kids on a lot of these campuses that you're looking at who sat in your exact seat a couple of years before. And I think that is too often not a tapped resource, right? Talking to people in your community who are alums of that institution who may have contacts when you go visit, they're like, oh, I know the chair of the sociology department, or,
Hmm.
I know a kid that's there right now. Use your network. That's why it's there. That is, and people want to be asked to help. Fundamentally, we want to be asked to help. So don't be timid about using your network. I would say that is one. The other thing, I guess, I'll just go back and sort of double click on the money piece.
Hmm.
I mean, I really think that that is just increasingly critical. And not just like what's the return on investment, what are the starting salaries, and how much does it cost on paper, and all of these kind of things. But as a family, this idea of really working together to come up with, and these were your words, a financial fit. And understanding how important that really is. Because fundamentally, keeping the end in mind. You're going to end up on a college campus somewhere. We don't know exactly where that's going to be. Our job is to have you as prepared and healthy as possible when you get there. And that's why you are studying. That's why you're working hard. It's not to get into a certain college. It's not college X preparation. It's college preparation. And all of this sort of ties together. And then I call it my sky banner message. So I'll just end with this. But, if, it's like at the beach, if somebody gave you a plane and said you could pull a message behind it. My big one is parents of high school students should talk to fewer parents of other high school students about college admission, and more parents of recent college grads or current college students. And if you think about it as a parent, this is what we've always done. When our kids were like potty training or, any of those early, we didn't talk to other parents who were going through the same thing. We talked to people that were a couple years past that and said, what's your advice? Right.
Right.
When now that we have teenagers or like preteens and tweens, we talk to people who have older kids and we say, how did you deal with that? What did you do? Right. When it came to technology, when it came to them not talking to you, it came to them rolling their eyes or whatever the thing is. You talk to your peers, they just drive your anxiety up because they have just as many questions and frustrations. And I think that that's super important, right? And because parents of other high school students, they lie, man. They lie. They exaggerate. They say things like, oh, did you know no kid from our high school has been admitted to that school in the last 5 years? Right. Or again, that dang school down the street, blah, blah, blah happened. It's not true. They heard it on this like third-hand information.
Well, Rick, they heard it on social media though, so it has to be true,
It's got
right?
to be true, man. It's got to be true. So yeah, I think those are a couple of things I would close with. And I think, ultimately, again, I just come back to the title of our book is The Truth About College Admission, but equally important, the subtitle is A Family Guide to Getting In and Staying Together. And that is why we wrote it. And that's why at the end of every chapter, there's questions for people to talk through. And this is really, I believe, it's about family. It's about healthy relationships, asking good questions, listening, compromising, giving and taking. And my hope is no matter where families end up in college, that they end up together, smiling, excited, taking that picture and feeling like how we did this is as important as where it led.
Well, those are great pieces of advice. And like I said earlier, I did read the book, The Truth About College Admission, second edition. And by the way, again, to all the listeners, I'm not being paid to say this. This book is really well done. And any family going through the college process, you owe it to yourself to definitely pick up a copy and check it out. Rick, you're awesome. Again, I thank you so much for your time, your expertise. I do hope to have you again, Rick, perhaps for episode 300. What do you think?
All right. Keep rolling, man. Keep rolling.
Well, I'm definitely going to keep rolling. And Rick, you are awesome. And one last thing to say to everyone out there, good luck and best wishes as you navigate the college process. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to tell a friend and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am your host, John Durante, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the CAP.
Hey, John. This is Danny from the University of Rhode Island. Dormify is my go-to for the most trend-forward and unique products for all of my rooms over the years. I love that no matter how my style changes, I can always go to Dormify for inspo to style my space. I cannot recommend it enough for anyone wanting to make their space their own. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you, Danny, for sharing your thoughts on Dormify. For those of you listening, be sure to check out our show notes where you could find our Dormify affiliate link and our most updated coupon code where you can save 15% on most Dormify products. As a reminder, our podcast does receive a small commission for purchases made through our affiliate link, but rest assured, we only promote products that we believe in and feel would benefit you, our listeners. Thank you, and best wishes to all.